what's interesting is you mentioned earlier that you felt Europe was taking a more hard line with China in this recent meeting as compared to the U.S. at APEC. But from what you just said, it sounds like even this harder line is not really that
It's like, oh,
hard.
we'll sell 24.9% of the port to China. So, technically it meets the
Yeah. And so if
rules.
it's that bad, like how bad is what the U.S. is doing?
Well, it's, I think, very hard for many in the US to understand that Europe doesn't really see, uh, they don't, okay, I live in Brussels, so I am surrounded by bureaucrats. And bureaucrats in general are just like, well, why? We don't want to pick a fight with China. Why would we want to do that? So there's a kind of a narrative that Europe is kind of trying to find a third way between the US and China, and that they will get through this third way. But the problem for them, and for example, Joseph Borrell, the High Representative, at the opening of a diplomatic academy here in Belgium to train the next generation of European diplomats, described Europe as a garden surrounded by a jungle. And so they feel that, here it's like a little perfect world, and outside it's really dangerous and horrible. Of course, he was démarched. All these countries complained that it was racist and really wrong-headed for him to speak this way about other countries. So, but this is kind of part of the European perspective. They're previously to 2019, their mantra was, "We don't do geopolitics." So the idea that money has no color, we can invest anywhere, it's all great since the wall came down in 1989. But I think that there has been a slow movement to more strategic thinking, and even the head of the European Commission, President Ursula von der Leyen, has declared that this was a geopolitical commission. So it's very difficult if everyone's been saying for decades, we don't do geopolitics, and then expect bureaucrats to instantly think geopolitically. In fact, I talk about this with some colleagues. They're apolitical. They have not a geopolitical bone in their body. So it's very difficult for them to perceive the world through that lens. And they are used to seeing the world through an economics lens. So it's happening, it's moving rather slowly. And there isn't any one voice in Europe on China policy. You have 27 EU member states. You have a country like Hungary, which tends to block or water down anything that China's not really interested in. So it tends to be the lowest common denominator of 27 EU member states. Nevertheless, there are workarounds sometimes to get around Hungarian blocks on various policy issues. So there's a movement, but it's much slower than, say, the US. The US it's one country. They can be far more nimble in their policymaking, whereas in Europe, it's very, very slow and sluggish. And I think they're getting some nudges as well from the United States. And also I'm talking about the European Union institutions, but we also have NATO here. And we've seen a huge wake-up call. About 2 years ago, they included China for the first time in their strategic outlook. And it went from just a mention now to, I think, about 10 paragraphs. I don't know the exact amount of paragraphs right now, but it's really becoming far more on their radar in terms of security issues. So I think that there has been a big change in perceptions in Europe on China.
So you mentioned there's sort of like this malaise with the bureaucracy of the EU and in Brussels. So I'm curious, do you have a sense for how European people feel about the situation with China? Is there a disconnect there?
Well, that's a good question, because Pew Research has been doing research over the years. And even before COVID, you saw that the trend was downwards. COVID accelerated negative outlook on China. And I think one of the highest negative outlooks in all of Europe is Sweden on China. So overall, I think the mean is about 26% having a favorable view of China. So it just depends on the country. They break it down. One of the most positive is Greece towards China. There's Costco owns the full Piraeus port in Greece. So it really depends where you sit. And Lithuania is probably another country that has a very negative perception. But overall, most of the EU member states individually have a very negative perception on China. But the reality is they do have a lot of economic exchange. And one of the most heavily dependent on trade would be Germany. And since they're one of the key countries in Europe, they kind of have a lot of say in how the policy is going to unfold. The other issue in European politics and it's Franco-German relations. It's described as the engine that pulls along the EU. Well, since Merkel has left the political scene, Scholz and President Macron of France, they really don't get along so well. So some people describe it as a Franco-German engine is broken. So you also even have competition between the two of them on policies. So Germany did not want to have an investigation into dumping of Chinese electric vehicles into the European market, but France was able to use their political savvy and have the commission examine that. So
Good for them. The French don't surrender.
so they're sometimes at odds, or there could be cover. You know what I'm saying? Like you can say, I didn't want them to do that type of investigation. We can't stop them. So right now that there's no publication yet on what the decision has been made about electric vehicle dumping. But at the same time, key areas like Huawei in the US, which Huawei has long been banned, Germany has not banned it yet. A Huawei electric battery plant is being built in France. They're breaking ground very soon. So China just keeps adding, keeps trying. And so they are making headway in other areas and creating dependencies that will be very worrisome in the future. Oh, and the other issue that I think kind of was a wake-up call for Europeans, this kind of Russia-China cooperation. We saw the recent new polar bear, kind of a Russian and China ship were going through the Baltic Sea, and some energy lines were cut, and also a digital infrastructure line was cut, very important. And it was kind of like a gray zone activity that said, it was a Chinese registered ship called the new Polar Bear based in Hainan, but registered in Hong Kong. It said that it had dragged unknowingly, which most people I speak to from Navy say that's impossible. You can't drag an anchor that long, that far, and not know that you were dragging it. So this type of gray zone activity is very worrisome to Europeans. So it seems like South China Sea is so far away from them, but now they're seeing activity connected to the Arctic and with Russia. So it's a bit of a problem for the Europeans. They can no longer think that this isn't really something we need to worry about. And that's another reason why NATO's also got China on their radar.